The content of this episode may not be suitable for some audiences. Listener's discretion is advised. Welcome to the place of rest, where our aim is to give you language that helps you displace the growing confusion, chaos, and dis-ease of our times. My name is Jonathan Boyce, and it's my pleasure to bring to you today's episode. Virginia and I discuss how reasoning through laws of nature restores our humanity. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. In raising awareness for the first responders, one of the things that we do on the website is to bring up some of the statistics and numbers that we're looking at, right?
Shocking.
Yes, very shocking numbers. The numbers of suicides is just astounding. The number of years that they're expected to live once they retire. One thing that I hear often as well is this idea that I'm just a number. Right? When I go to work, they look at my numbers, how I performed, how our group of guys has performed against another precinct or whatever it may be. There's a lot of competition around numbers. And then when they have the unthinkable happens and there is some kind of triggering event which causes them to get derailed, they go to look for help in a system that again just looks at them as a number. And they look at these numbers and they're either approved or denied based on a number, which further reinforces this narrative of you are just a number.
I have a lot to say about that. Given the intensity of what we have experienced as a company, taking into account the confusion, chaos, and dis-ease of the age and the consequence it's having in the very constitution of the people we serve, both the individual, families, institutions of faith, because there's so much skepticism, and government, there's so much skepticism. So it feels like these divine institutions, from the character and conscience of a man, but specifically the family, institutions of faith, and the state, everything's imploding. Francis Schaeffer said it best. And if you don't know who Francis Schaeffer is, please Google him and read everything you can. Go to YouTube. You'll hear a lot about Francis Schaeffer. But he talked about post-Renaissance. Soren Kierkegaard and a bunch of great thinkers began to, for the first time in recorded history, took God out of the equation and himself and put himself out and began to analyze everything. And he became a law unto himself. And the consequence of that analysis, because the sciences had blossomed, had exploded, right? So man began to do what? Become proud, as we often do. He took himself out of the equation. It says everything that can be known about us. I mean, I'm grossly paraphrasing, right? But everything that can be known about us and the world around us and creation and everything can be understood by man. And so man became the arbiter of truth. And he began to examine everything. And Francis Schaeffer observed through what happened with art and music. Because you know what's happening in the heart of man? By how it's translated in art. Go look at art without reading a single thing from the beginning of time throughout history. And I mean hieroglyphics throughout history. We can go to AI now and get a picture of that. And you're going to make an observation of something. And Francis Schaeffer said from the Renaissance on, he began to observe the reality of the emergence of what he called the line of despair, where we began to separate the secular bottom story from the sacred upper story. And he said by the 20th century, the divide would be so great that man would begin to implode and self-destruct. When man began to analyze everything through reason, right, he in fact escaped from reason because he realized, wait a minute, look what's happened in science and philosophy and theology. And these great thinkers began to philosophize with good intentions, right? Those good intentions really have paved the way to hell. Because in those good intentions, they began to escape from reason. They began to make everything about that which was observable only, and they neglected the life of their heart. So the line of despair that began to emerge was everything began to be secularized. and examined through reason. Right. But then what happens to the life of the heart? All the existential realities and experiences that we have that can't be explained. Right? So what happens? He said, in time, if we don't stop this nonsense and we don't accept the fact that everything isn't relative to reason, everything isn't relative to what we can reason and what we don't reason. There is this secular way of looking at things, but it can't omit the tangible, if you will, way of looking at things, but we can't omit the spiritual constitution of all these things we can't explain. Broken heart syndrome. Our listening audience can go check that out for themselves. People go into a comatose state basically and are completely dysfunctional. They look like they're dead in a coma, but they're not. It's a broken heart syndrome. The separation has become so great that their body and their heart, they just can't engage. And I think that comes to mind right now. Physical disease as a result of what Schaefer was trying to explain to us, almost 80 years ago now. And in fact, that's exactly what's happened. And he said by the end of the 20th century, the lower story, everything secular, would engulf and destroy everything sacred. And so man would begin to become a number, self-destruct. And that's exactly what's happening. And by the way, the anatomy of an addiction fundamentally is to suppress and to numb and to cope and just disregard and pursue what? The tangible pleasures and things that we think sustain our life, but will destroy it if we neglect what's happening in our hearts. And I know that's kind of a big explanation, but perhaps if nothing else, our listening audience can go look up Francis Schaeffer, look up The Line of Despair. And basically that's where the reason began to further fragment man since the fall significantly. Because until that time, until the Renaissance, Sorensen, Kierkegaard, and all these guys began to reason through God basically out of, and that's overstated again, but still, it does make the point that here, fast forward to 2025, we become numbers. And if you really think about it, there's your truth. Everybody has their own truth. No. You have your own opinions, which are beautiful and valuable and important and worth discussing. But you don't get to decide what truth is. Your perspective might shed light on an angle, a perspective of something that is true or not, and might inform us as to what's true or not. But you don't get to decide what is true and what's not. Truth is a law of nature. We often talk about shedding light on a topic. What's light? Light is energy and frequency. What does light expose? Anything hidden that's not true. Who did Jesus say he was? The light of the world. He exposes what's truth. So anything that is not true will die a slow death, and it'll take us down with it. Churchill often said the truth is so valuable and so important that it's often surrounded by a body of lies. So this concept of becoming a number is because humanity has so strayed from what is true and what is not, that we've really become a law unto ourselves. And if we're going to become a law unto ourselves, we're going to self-destruct because it is not the truth. There is a lawgiver, and he told us everything and imprinted our bodies with it and imprinted our souls and our conscience with the knowledge of his laws. And if we neglect them, we become a law unto ourselves and we'll self-destruct. We'll be sick. But at the end of the day, people have become a number because truth has become relative to everybody's individual truth. So people have become a law unto themselves. And when you become a law unto yourself, everything self-destructs. The concept of a number is a perfect example of what happens when humanity strays from laws of nature, self-evident truth, and natural affection. When they stray from universal principles that are the truth, that are obvious and speak to our hearts, rest being one of them. We understand that rest is instrumental for our survival. It is vital. Without rest, we die. but we don't know how to translate that little word into every facet of our life. So when institutions, the family, the church, the state, and the individual becomes compromised, right? Confusion, chaos, and dis-ease reigns either in the soul of a man, either in a family, in institutions of faith, or institutions of civil government. When confusion, chaos, and dis-ease reigns, that means we're not in a place of what? Rest. If we're not in a place of rest, what's going to happen? We're going to have more and more and more laws and regulations and demands, and it's going to feed what? More and more and more tyranny, and more rebellion, and more confusion, chaos, and disease. So what happens? When institutions, for example, find themselves in that state, they issue more and more and more laws. They regulate, they legislate, they confiscate. And when they do that, what happens? They need to give everything a number. They need to create more structure, more control, more dominion. When you have numbers like that, you lose the history, the government, and education that is imperative for us to heal. And that's why we invite people that they got to take that back. You're not a number. But instead of making our appeal to civil government, instead of making our appeal to churches, instead of making our appeals just to families, we do what? We make our appeal to the individual. We make our appeal to the people that are, in fact, experiencing the confusion, chaos, and disease and the complexities of that. And they're the most invested in their own healing. So instead of going to these other institutions that are so far removed from the individual, we take the message of rest to the individual to say this can be transformative in your life. Whether you have cancer, autoimmune diseases, divorce, whatever, abuse, it doesn't matter. Whether it's a fire department, a police department, it doesn't matter. Let me summarize it by saying this. Individuals run institutions. So if we're going to bring transformative change to institutions, it's going to have to start with the individual, the one. I don't have time to get into the complexities of why numbers. It's not just first responders that are numbers and feel like numbers. All of us in measure do, because what's happened is we have so fragmented what it is to be an individual, spirit, soul, body, to the point that now we're in a state of confusion, chaos, and disease about what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman. Thankfully, there's these universal principles that are common to all, and they're obvious. If you have DNA that is that congruent with male genitalia, and you have DNA congruent with female genitalia, it doesn't matter what you change externally. Internally, you are what you are. So we have laws of nature that are self-evident that can be a lifeline for us right now, because we can hold on to that truth and not be segregated, relegated to just a number. We're triune beings made in the image of a triune God that created a triune science, time, space, and matter to explain balance, harmony, and coherence and everything else that sustains our life. So I think we've been relegated to numbers because we've escaped from reason. We've segregated the secular and the sacred, science from religion, if you will, spirituality from reality, if you will. And that's an escape from reason, and it's going to reduce us to nothing. And because it's a lie, it'll cause self-destruction. And the path to self-destruction is identifying people merely as numbers. In a very small way, that's the imprint, I think. That's the footprint that we have in this conversation around mental health and healing and wellness in time, that we're trying to displace that conversation. We've become numbers because we've escaped from reason, and we've fractured the constitution of a man, neglecting the function of his conscience and the function of his soul, right? Mind, heart, will, conscience, and feelings, in the discussion of it being the most powerful force on earth and the primary sphere of government is the soul of a man. That's why we've just become a number. And I guess you got to delve deep into history for that. I always mention Francis Schaeffer. I mention the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Romans, and how in the fullness of time, this different narrative came into time that introduced the concept of freedom into the world, that you can be free, But you need to understand liberty to be free. And then we have to see how man has governed since the beginning of time and since his origins, right? And then we have to educate ourselves in that. So there you go, government, history, and education again. So it's a very complex question you're asking me. And it's hard for me to give you a shallow answer. But I believe that man has become a number, and our first responders feel like number, not just them, but the general population as well, because we've escaped from reason and man has become a law unto himself. And I don't think that's consistent with universal principles, laws of nature. I don't think that's consistent with that. I think it is consistent with what happens if man escapes from reason and doesn't deal with the reality of his condition and his constitution. He's going to become just a number, not just to others, but even to himself. Because you don't have a sense of purpose or meaning or significance. And so you're going to do what? You're going to be reduced to living according to your own truth, which is you become a law unto yourself. And that is a lie. You cannot be a law unto yourself because you live in community. So the fragmentation, the disintegration of truth, the manipulation of laws of nature that are obvious to us and speak to our natural affection by academics and by all kinds of things that want to control, that's how we become a number. So the resistance needs to be taking responsibility for our own agency, both from beginning with how we think, how we reason, and then confronting the reality of our depravity and the conflict between the stories we tell ourselves and the ones that are carried in our body, and really recognizing and disparaging between those two things, and doing what? Turning. When you see you're in conflict with yourself, what do? You stop and turn. And then that's where freedom can be accessed.
And what I've noticed is when engaging with compassion, gentleness, and care in what you are discussing with the first responders, there's that realization that, oh, I violated my conscience. I didn't speak up. I just went with the program. I just engaged in that disintegration and made myself a number, agreed with that. And
that's right.
It's incredible to see like that.
The transformation is unbelievable, right? Yeah. Because that is a law of nature, what you just described. The power to rule and overrule in their own circumstances is contained within their own agency. And transformation happens with how we think about things. So at R.E.S.T, we try to really delve deep into these big ideas and help people reason and displace confusion, chaos, and disease by taking into account of history, government, and education, not just in their own little myopic little life, but in the history of man and nations. And I know it seems like a big theme, but we really do break this down. And we invite people to reason and think differently, but we substantiate everything we teach. And then we, of course, invite people to examine the truth of these things or not for themselves. It's a rigorous program, but first of all, it advances the cause of love because they can see how we pour our heart and soul into what we've accomplished with R.E.S.T and what we do. They see that we're integritists. We live R.E.S.T. We labor to live R.E.S.T. Because it's not like they're sick and we're not. No, we're all in this matrix together. So they see that we reinforce the integrity of the process. And it always points back to the things that are existential and sacred about our common humanity. So it's this unifying thing. And all of a sudden, the things of the world slowly become dimmed in light of the glory of people's capacity to exercise liberty, to secure freedom, and to self-govern, and to live free. Therein lies the value of what we do. I've had to wrestle with bringing these disciplines together in a world that's fragmented education. It's not that man has just become fragmented after the Renaissance and what I described about Schaeffer and the line of despair and all of that, because that really explains why we're at where we're at. And I dream of the day where instead of discussing politics, we're discussing ideas. Instead of talking about people, we're discussing about these laws of nature that are self-evident and speak to our natural affection. And we can all together watch our souls and our spirits soar beyond the brutality of what we're experiencing. because the power and the authority is contained in this little territory within the heart of man, and it's his mind. So if we can transform the mind and cause people to really take account of history, government, and education as a universal principle that we can examine everything by, wow, you and I witness and see the miracles. When you ask, why have we just become a number? My mind rises to what's happened with philosophy, what's happened with theology, what's happened with the sciences, and what's happened with man, that he's become so corrupt that to get a Nobel Prize, to get a jump on research, he would steal from another, that there's so much stealing of intellectual property. We've become a number because our character and conscience has corrupted, and man has become a law unto himself, and he's self-destructing. And at R.E.S.T, we're trying to help people understand why it happened, when it happened, how it happened. And I'd be negligent if I didn't say that this whole dynamic is very well documented in the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is a book about the story of us. And the entire rest of the Bible is how God works in the lives of us, men and nations. And the beginning of the demise and the threat of being a number is from the choices ultimately that Adam made. Authority was given to Adam. Do not eat of this tree was given to Adam. Adam and Eve did not sin. Adam sinned. Eve was deceived. And then she sinned. But Adam was standing right there during the whole thing. That's why he's held responsible. And it's an honor to work with so many first responders and with men specifically. But it's an honor to work with them because they've got to step into a place of rightful authority to change this mess around. And for women, you have an enormous amount of power. Power was given to you. Authority was given to men. Authority without power is nothing. Power without authority is nothing. These things need to be together. Think about it as the mind and the heart. That's the line of despair that became fractured. And it's really interesting because in the garden, that's exactly what was fractured. Relationship between Adam and Eve, between God and man. And then, of course, Adam and Eve and everything else. They blamed each other, accused each other, and all of that. But the beautiful part is there was a restoration. There's a narrative of restoration of that. And that is in the fullness of time, 4,000 some years later, right? This other figure steps into time who says he's the Son of God. And he came to restore that which was fallen. And the restoration is he restored our capacity to self-govern. Because that's really what Adam and Eve gave up in the garden. They didn't really realize that. But dominion, the power to have dominion, to be fruitful and multiply, to subdue and to have dominion of, was given to them. So they were seduced by what? Did God really say? You're not going to die. He just doesn't want you to be like him. There again, pattern of 3 again, right? And how does that show up? I want, I need, I deserve. Those are the 3 things that'll derail your life. And so what happened? That became our nature because they were seduced. And what did they do? They lied. They believed the lie. They became confused. They violated their conscience, and then they covered, they hid, and they blamed. And that became the anatomy of man. So that's how we became a number. We became a law unto ourselves, and we became irrelevant, and we began to self-destruct. And it was all according to what we did with our free agency, right? Adam sinned, Eve was deceived. But it was still it was what they did, their free agency. They forfeited all power and authority to who? To this other being that was called Lucifer. Interestingly enough, light, which is interesting. He has the amplifier of light and music and everything, which is interesting because light is energy, right? Frequency, right? Resonance, all that stuff. What's music? Really? Energy, frequencies, resonance, vibrations, and all that. So you start connecting all of that. So it's really interesting because the true light of the world came into the world with Jesus to restore all of that. So the theological basis of what we use to reason really becomes instrumental because it isn't just a theology, it's science, and science is the truth. And I believe science is God because God made the world and everything in it. And the basis of science, again, is time, space, and matter. Trinitarian constitution of everything, just like him. And I think that's a fingerprint of God in time.
Is this Christian Science?
Somebody pointed that out. No, because the object of our faith is a person. And the object of power and authority in heaven and on earth rests in the person of Christ who said, if you are willing to stop, if you're weary and you're burdened and you're heavy laden and you come to me, I will give you rest for your soul. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. Then he says, what? Come and learn from me. Man keeps wanting to separate and relegate and take authority and dominion over all these doctrines. There's only one doctrine. The world is God's and everything in it. And the Trinitarian constitution of all things, substantiated by universal laws, principles. That means common to all. They're self-evident, they're obvious, and they speak to our natural affection, is the fingerprint of God in our life. But at the end of the day, you have a conscience, a quiet, still voice that informs you. If you become a law unto yourself and you're the object of the authority, then you're going down the wrong path. But you can step into rest and experience freedom and surrender to the fact that, wow, I have a dad in heaven. He knows my name. He's been talking to me since the beginning of time. He has every hair in my head numbered. That's the antithesis of being just a number. He knows me by name. He knew me. He formed me in my womb. He knew me before I was born. And I was made to be like him. No, I think it's the story of freedom. It's untouchable. You just can't have freedom without liberty. You got to self-govern. You got to choose because God made you like him to choose. So yes, it is Christian and it is very much science. But no, it's not Christian science because rest is not bound by a theology. It's a law of nature. It's self-evident and it speaks to our natural affection. And I think I want our listening audience to know and understand that we can't conceive of living through a crisis that somebody else has to experience. But I promise you that the gift of rest is the promise of freedom. And it comes from a personal and intimate God and the testimony of Christ in time that's well recorded by historians. And you can experience joy in the midst of despair. When my daughter had a brain tumor, I got a glimpse of that. And there just isn't language to explain that. But there is this intimate person that exists, that informs us and speaks to us, that meets us in these places of despair. So wherever you find yourself in life, and certainly some of the families that are experiencing unthinkable things, much like our first responders, wow, can I just extend to you the promise of rest and the gift of freedom? It's there for the taking when you're ready.
We hope listening to this episode has brought you closer to experiencing the freedom of wholeness and healing. If you have questions or comments about today's episode, or for updates about rest, please visit our Instagram or Facebook at The Place of Rest. If you would like more information about Virginia, or to support and join the cause of rest, please go to theplaceofrest.com/donate or call 949-289-5935. Thank you for listening to Rest with Virginia Dixon. We'll see you next week.